Today we're going to delve into the case of Natalie Wood. Lately I've been doing, reading autopsies, for better or for worse. That's the information. And this time I started to look into the Natalie Wood case. There's always just so much information. I was looking at my file on my computer, and I've got hundreds, literally probably about 500 pieces of tabloids and photographs that I've taken, and there's a lot of information. Then I went through the autopsy report, which is fairly easy. I promise I'm not going to get into too much detail to annoy people, but I'll be reading that. But then the autopsy got updated, and there's lots of rumors and speculation, and I'm going to try to stay away from all of that, but I'll read what I can do. Part of it has to do with Dr. Noguchi, who wrote this book, Coroner. He also wrote Coroner at Large, and I've had the opportunity to meet Dr. Noguchi, and it was a real treat to meet him. Also, I'll be quoting Chief Craig Harvey, who is the retired Director of Special Investigations for the LA County Coroner. And also, I've got a comment from my friend Mike Steen, who was the funeral director that handled Natalie Wood. So I've got two people who are experts on what happened to Natalie Wood posthumously. And it's going to be interesting. I think you'll find it interesting. It's going to be technical a bit, and it's going to be lengthy, but I promise you, I think you'll find it kind of interesting. So, and I've highlighted, and I've got articles, and there's a lot of stuff here. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to start getting into it. So the case report is dated. Her body was found on 11/29/1981. It was Thanksgiving weekend of 1981. Her body was found by the LA County lifeguards. Actually, it was found by two people that were on a search, and ultimately lifeguards. And the harbor master was notified when her body was discovered at 7:44 a.m. Natalie Wagner, aka Wood, married actress, address 603 North Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills. Place of death, the Pacific Ocean off Catalina Island, Isthmus of Catalina Island. That's a little bay area of Catalina where their boat was moored. And the person who was notified was Dennis Davern, who was the skipper of the boat. And I believe he in turn informed Robert Wagner of it. It says personal or by next of kin called and notified by Dennis Davern, who was a skipper of the boat. Natalie is described as female Caucasian, age 43, height 64 inches, weight 120 pounds, brown hair and brown eyes. And the mortuary who handled Natalie Wood is Westwood Village, and now it's Pierce Brothers Westwood Memorial Park. And as I mentioned, my friend Mike Steen was the person who handled her funeral. And I'll be interviewing Mike Steen in the future about his time at Westwood Cemetery. He was there for quite a long time, and then he moved on to Woodlawn Cemetery, and he handled several famous people's funerals, and he's offered to, said yes to my asking him for an interview. So hopefully that'll be in a few weeks. So I'll just read briefly part of the autopsy report, or I'll read the whole thing, but here's what it says. Decedent, meaning the dead person, is actress Natalie Wood, who along with her husband and a friend, Christopher Walken, the actor, and the skipper of the boat, this Davern guy, were spending the weekend on Catalina Island. In the early morning hours of Sunday, November 29th, 1981, sometime after the group had returned to the boat, which was moored off Isthmus, Robert Wagner became aware that his wife and the boat's dinghy, which is the little rubber boat that was attached to it, that they could, when they went onto shore to eat at the restaurant or just to get to their car or whatever it was, they would get on this little tiny motorboat, inflatable motorboat, and leave their big boat in the ocean, and they could take the little one back and forth, and that's called a dinghy. And so they said they returned to the boat, which was moored off Isthmus, became aware that his wife and boat's dinghy were both missing. He immediately radioed for help, and a search was begun. Mrs. Wagner's body was spotted from the air by a sheriff's department helicopter that was en route to the island to assist with the search. LA County lifeguards and 2 private searchers were the first ones to reach the body of Mrs. Wagner and pulled her from the water, whereupon she was pronounced dead at 7:44 a.m. Now, Robert Wagner, the last time he remembers seeing his wife was 11:45 p.m. When he realized his wife was missing, he placed the radio call for help. Don Whiting heard the ship's radio call for help. Mr. Whiting lives on a boat and during his waking hours always monitors the radio. He heard Robert Wagner at about 1:30 a.m. and in turn called a friend on Isthmus to go to the Wagner boat and advise him of the situation and if a search could be or should be started. When it was determined that the dinghy and Natalie Wood were missing, a search begun with the Harbor Patrol, Baywatch, private searchers, LA County Sheriff, and the U.S. Coast Guard all participating. The dinghy was found near the shoreline earlier before Natalie Wood's body was discovered, was also and Robert Wagner was also questioned the possibility of suicide. However, he states that his wife was not suicidal. Her body had been taken from the ocean and placed in a hyperbaric chamber for safekeeping. So basically to preserve her body as much as possible until they transported her to the LA County coroner. Some of this information is going to be repeated throughout this. So it says, upon this investigators arrived at the location, she was observed lying in Stokes litter, which is a basket, one of those baskets that they carry bodies in, they might lift it up. And investigators arrive or take her out of the water and put her on another boat. So it was just that sort of basket type of thing. She was wrapped in a plastic sheet, and she herself is dressed in a flannel nightgown and socks. The jacket that she was wearing when found floating is no longer on the body, having come off when she was pulled from the water. At the time Natalie Wood was pulled from the water, the sheriff's personnel says that the body was absent of any rigor mortis. She still has foam coming from her mouth. Rigor is now present. This is at the time of the autopsy, at the degree of 3 to 4, which I looked up. 3 to 4 is moderate to advanced rigor mortis, where the body begins to harden and becomes obvious the body is no longer loose or flexible. And number 4 is advanced. Most muscles are now stiff and do not bend. So it was between 3 and 4 when she was being autopsied. The decedent has numerous bruises to legs and arms. Her eyes are also a bit cloudy appearing. No other trauma noted, and foul play is not suspected at this time. That's the investigation they did. Now, when they on the ship, they actually took Natalie Wood's prescriptions with them because they have to, along in the autopsy, they have to do the alcohol report to find out how much alcohol is in her body at the time of her death, and also any drugs that she was taking. And this is a list of the drugs that they confiscated, I guess, from the ship. And it was Darvon, which is a painkiller. Actually, here's something to show you. This was a gift to me from my friend E.J. Fleming, God rest his soul. E.J. was a historian of the best kind, and he actually gave me this. And this is Natalie Wood's Darvon prescription. Now, it's not from the ship on that day. This one is dated actually 1979, May of 1979. And this, actually, no, it says January 28, 1978. That's what it is. That must be the refills or something like that. So this was several years before. So this is actually a Natalie Wood genuine prescription bottle filled by the Beverly Hills Beverly Pharmacy. Darvon compound number 65. Take as directed. Natalie Wagner. N. Wagner. Placidil, which is for insomnia. Optimine, which I think is a motion sickness drug. Methadone, which is for high blood pressure. Antivert, which is for motion sickness. Dulmans, which is for insomnia. Cythroid, which is a hormone, a thyroid hormone, and Bactrim, which is an antibiotic. Also found was Valium, and Valium. It says also a red capsule of Placido, but we already covered that one. Now, there's a body illustration here that comes on this page, and it says reported surface water temperature at the time found 62 to 63 degrees, which is quite cold if you're immersed in it. Livor mortis, which is lividity, which is when you die, your blood stops circulating. And if you happen to die sort of, let's say, face down, like Marilyn did, all the blood, since it's no longer circulating, sinks down with gravity into her face. So her face was quite discolored when they found her. So they're saying very slight lividity in this on the back of her, which blanches under pressure, which means if you touch it, that means it changes color, doesn't it? It blanches. If you're touching your skin, it goes back to the regular color. Yeah. So it says she was wearing a flannel nightgown, socks, and a down jacket, which is now off the body. The official cause of death in the autopsy report is listed as drowning. Superficial skin bruises on the extremities and abrasions on the left side of face. Now, this is all very important. That particular thing about the bruising is very important. Now, the external description of Natalie Wood. The body is that of a well-developed and well-nourished Caucasian female, which appears to be about the stated age of 43 years old, weighing approximately 120 pounds. The hair is brown and long. The eyes are brown. There are no petiche, which is the whites of the eyes are turning different colors, isn't it, Troy? You know that. Petechio, and that means,
yeah.
So, because if something were to happen traumatic to their face, it would show in her eyes, like broken blood vessels or something. If something were to happen,
blood vessels break.
Yeah. So there was nothing like that. There wasn't like head trauma at that point that caused that sort of injury to her eyes. Let's see. The ears are not remarkable. The neck, chest, and abdomen show abnormality except for an old surgical scar on the lower midline of the abdominal wall, measuring approximately 5 inches in length. So that must have been a misprint. No chest and abdomen show no abnormality. It just says abnormality. The right forearm shows diffuse recent bruise over the lateral aspect, measuring approximately 4 inches by 1 inch, the area above the wrist. Now, a slight superficial fresh bruise is noted in this area, measuring approximately 1/2 inch in diameter. There are numerous small superficial skin bruises over the right and left lower legs, measuring approximately 1/2 inch to 1 inch in diameter. They appear to be relatively fresh. The left knee shows an area of recent bruise, measuring approximately 2 inches in diameter, and the right ankle shows a recent bruise, measuring approximately 2 inches in diameter. There are superficial bruises on the posterior aspect of the lower legs. They are small, superficial, and measuring approximately 1/2 inch to 2 inches in diameter. The organs in the chest and the abdomen are located in the normal places. There are no traumatic injuries over the chest or the abdomen. No hemorrhages noted on the chest wall or chest cavities. The abdominal cavity shows no excessive fluid. So that's all very normal. Now, the respiratory system, the larynx, trachea, and bronchi are filled with a large amount of white froth. The lumps are voluminous and heavy. The liver is about normal in size, weighing 1,450 grams. The digestive system, because they had just had dinner shortly before that, and a very boozy dinner at that. So the digestive system, the tongue shows no abnormality. The stomach shows a froth, but the esophagus shows no abnormality except for a small amount of partly digested food. The stomach is filled with approximately 50 cc's of semi-solid, partly digested food. Most of the food appears to be either chicken or fish type of substance. In addition, there are a few patchy areas of red discoloration in the stomach contents. The small intestine contains 2 pills which are not dissolved, and they appear to be of a large size of vitamin-like substance as they appeared and by the smell. Because, like vitamins do have a distinctive smell to them. The gastric contents emit the smell of alcohol. The appendix is not remarkable. The small and large intestine show no injury. No tumor is noted, and that. There are numerous small superficial skin bruises over the legs, but there are no deep contusions noted on the sections. The wounds show no fracture. The abrasions over the left cheek area appear to be superficial and fresh. The abrasions are brush-type abrasions on the vertical dimension. They're saying that she may have, when she fell into the water, that she may have been scratching to get into the dinghy and scratched her face on the surface of the dinghy, possibly. No hemorrhage is noted with the temporal bones in the ear. And the toxicological tests, the blood, urine, bile, and stomach contents, liver tissue, and kidney tissue are submitted for investigation. So they take those pieces of those organs and take them and analyze them for what is in the system, and they can tell everything that's in the system. And the witnesses of the autopsy are investigating officer Serrano and his partner of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department came to witness the autopsy. The autopsy findings are consistent with drowning in the ocean. The time of the death is difficult to pinpoint, but it appears to be about midnight of November 28th, 1981. Most of the bruises on the body are superficial, probably sustained at the time of drowning. But that makes complete sense. They were saying that Dr. Noguchi, in his book, the Coroner book, he came to the conclusion, since there was a wooden, at the back of the boat is like a wooden, something you can literally step off into the water. The dinghy was actually tied to the boat. And they're saying that Natalie might have been annoyed with the dinghy banging against the boat because the water was kind of rough. And then she may have fallen into the ocean when that happened accidentally. There was no proof that she was trying to get back onto the boat through that step on the back of the boat that's even with the water, which would have been, a logical thing to do. So that's why there's some sort of question about this. They say she could easily have, got back on the boat in that way, but they checked the step and there was the algae or nothing was disturbed, so she didn't attempt that. But there was evidence on the dinghy that she had attempted to get into the dinghy. But you see the oars on the dinghy were still fastened down and the motor wasn't working. The motor, when they found the dinghy separate from her body, the motor was turned to the off position. So she probably never got in the thing because the water was rough. It was probably, washing away and she was trying to hang on to it, and she logically probably should have gone back to the ship, but instead she was going with the dinghy, and she tried several times to get back onto the dinghy. And the drowning, they say, may have been caused by the down vest she was wearing that soaked with water. They weighed the vest. They got the vest, they got all her clothes, and the vest weighed, they say, about 40 pounds. So that, with her high alcohol content, which we're going to go into in a little bit, may have messed with her judgment, and she chose the wrong vehicle to try to get back into. Or she just started going further away from the boat. She couldn't do anything about it. The people did hear her scream, but there was a large party going on the beach on one of the houses, because it wasn't that far off the island, and there was a large party with loud music playing. And then people did hear her scream, but they say a lot of people, didn't take it seriously, and that added to the mystery of it. Now, when the toxicology reports were returned, it's important to note, actually, that when those tests are being done for drugs in her system, they only test for specific drugs. So if they're looking for something like morphine, particularly, if they do the test, something else like arsenic isn't going to show up because they didn't test for those particular drugs.
So what they did test for in Natalie's case was sedatives, barbiturates, cocaine, and morphine. All showed up as ND, not determined. They didn't find that. But they did find Darvon and the motion sickness drug called cyclazine. And they tested for alcohol. It shows up as ethanol on the report, but it's alcohol, and it was at 0.14%, which is significant because the legal limit was 0.10%, and she was well over that. So that meant her judgment was significantly impaired that night.
Now, on the anniversary of Natalie Wood's death, the ship captain, Davern was his name, he decided to change his story, and he wrote a book about it. And he said that he was kind of mysterious about Robert Wagner, saying that he lied in the original report, and he was taking back his words and changing the narrative of the story. The story has always been, there was a fight. Either Natalie Wood, Christopher Walken and Robert Wagner were getting into a fight, and Natalie Wood got disgusted and left. That's the common story. There are all sorts of theories about what happened after, what caused her to leave the room. But ultimately, she left the room. And it was about, maybe 45 minutes or an hour or maybe a little bit more than that Robert Wagner noticed that the dinghy was gone and Natalie wasn't around, and figured, oh, there she goes. She probably went to shore to get another drink or something to that effect. And after more amount of time, he apparently called the restaurant. They didn't see her. And they were pretty tanked when they got back to the ship, too. In fact, the owner of the restaurant, when he saw them going from the restaurant and their very boozy dinner back to the ship, and he saw they're kind of hammered, he called somebody else to make sure they made it back to the ship. So there was a lot of booze being consumed that night. And they, the official thing that Dr. Noguchi said in the press conference, which got him in trouble because he was speculating, but he said a, quote, nonviolent argument over general purposes happened and Natalie stormed off. And that's what Robert Wagner figured she did. But after a period of time, he realized something's not quite right. And that's when he radioed for help. Now, when they reopened the case, they tried to get in touch with Robert Wagner. Everyone cooperated with the investigation, but Robert Wagner would not cooperate. He said, everything I said, I had to say. The detectives tried to reach out to him, and the coroner's report, it changed the cause of death, not just from drowning, but we're going to get into that in just a moment. But the sheriff's department wanted to interview Robert Wagner again. So that's 30 years? And Robert Wagner said no. Basically, to himself, he said, I've done all this. We went through all that. It was exhausting. I'm not going to go through it again. The sheriff's department said that they have tried to get they tried to get to Robert Wagner, but he made it clear that he was not going to be interviewed. So that says that they reopened the case because there were conflicting statements about when Natalie Wood disappeared, and that had to do with Davern and his book. So they decided that they were going to reopen Natalie Wood's case. She died in 1981. The book came out in 2011 because of the speculation that Dennis Davern in his book said that he actually was with Robert Wagner the whole time or something to that effect. I don't even remember, because the fact that he had a book out is I just thought it was kind of gross. But I got to talk to my friend Craig Harvey, who's the retired chief of special investigations for the LA County Coroner, and he told me more about what they had done when they reopened the case. No. This is a supplemental report that was released on this later anniversary, and it says on it, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department has reopened the case in the fall of 2011 and had requested the current chief medical examiner to reevaluate the case. Now, Craig wasn't the chief medical examiner, but he was the chief of special investigations. So a lot of times when it came to high profile stuff, Craig Harvey was the guy who would speak to the press. He spoke to the press like Whitney Houston and the press conferences and Michael Jackson as well. And they had interviewed the former chief medical examiner, Dr. Noguchi, who did the autopsy originally, and other witnesses. During the interview with the former chief medical examiner coroner, Dr. Noguchi, they were made aware of a consultation report by one Mr. Paul Miller. Now, Paul Miller, I wrote down this, Dr. Noguchi in his book explains who Paul Miller was. He was the medical examiner and chief consultant over ocean accidents. That's what Dr. Noguchi called him. He also had his own ship moored at the same buoy as the Wagners were that night. So basically where their ship was parked in the bay, this guy, Paul Miller, just happened to be literally just probably yards from that, even though Paul Miller says he didn't hear any of the yelling either, along with a lot of other people. And also Chief Craig Harvey, who we know, which is retrieved. He's the one who retrieved the microfilm archives of Natalie Wood's file. See, there were certain body parts that were taken of Natalie Wood's and autopsied further, and also samples of her body parts, her liver and her brain, etc. And those were retained by the LA County coroner, although in the original investigation, literally the brain was taken out, literally probably the liver. I know that certain patches of her skin were taken out, carved out to, sort of memorialize the bruises on her body since they occurred before she died, because, bruises have to do with blood flow. And once you die, you don't get bruises anymore. It has to do with your blood flowing and how it affects how it goes to the surface. So the current chief medical examiner discussed, this is a totally different doctor. This is the doctor in 2011, and I can't say his name, so I'm not going to. His evaluation of the case concerned for non-accidental mechanism for certain bruises of the upper extremities. He also said that there was no evidence of head trauma and that the bruises, especially in the upper extremities, appeared fresh and could have occurred before she entered the water. And that's the big thing. They couldn't tell when the bruising occurred. So that was the basis of them reopening Natalie Wood's case back in 2011. Now, during the initial interview, when the husband, meaning Robert Wagner, of the decedent, indicated that he, Ms. Wood, Natalie Wood, the ship's captain, this Davern guy, and another actor friend who we know as Christopher Walken, were drinking in the main cabin of the boat, and they realized that Natalie Wood was missing. And also the Zodiac was missing. This was around midnight. Now, the Zodiac was the brand name of the dinghy, although the dinghy was called Valiant. And the boat that they were on was actually called Splendor, and they called it that because of Natalie Wood's movie Splendor in the Grass. But Valiant, I don't know where that name came from, but the yacht that they were on was called the Splendor, and the little rubber boat that was attached to it was called the Valiant. Brand name Zodiac. So that's it might be a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. The restaurant manager indicated that they heard Mrs. Wagner's husband call for help at 1:30 a.m. on November 29th. A search was soon begun with the Harbor Patrol, Baywatch, and private searchers. The captain indicated, this is Davern who wrote the book, indicated that they had gone ashore in the afternoon of the 28th to have dinner and were initially at the bar drinking until 7 or 8 p.m. After dinner, they left for the Splendor around 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. and continued drinking on board. Davern indicated that they discovered Ms. Wood, the decedent, missing only around 12 midnight. They presumed she had gone ashore and back to the bar. At 1:30 a.m., the husband called employees to look for Ms. Wood. According to the bartender who attended to them on November 28th, they continued to drink until 7:30 or 8 p.m. They were generally quiet. Neither the victim nor her husband acted drunk, but the ship's captain and their friend did appear intoxicated. Interesting. According to the bartender, they left the restaurant about 10:15 p.m. All four of them made a toast and broke their wine glasses. He felt they were all pretty shaky. At the restaurant, Ms. Wagner had been dressed in blue designer jeans, a yellow sweater, and a red down jacket. She also had jewelry, which included a necklace and 2 or more rings. The Zodiac dinghy, named the Valiant, involved in the incident was found against the rocks at an area called the Blue Cavern Point, 1.25 miles northeast of the Isthmus Pier where the Splendor was moored. Now, this goes into a lot of detail about what happened that night and the investigation and how it went, and I'll spare you a lot of that. But remember, this is the supplemental report. This is 40 years now since it happened, but when they reopened the case, it was 30.
Yeah.
So, a sexual assault kit was collected at the Forensic Science Center by a particular doctor. Also, hair samples were collected from her head and arm areas. Dr. Noguchi collected nasal swabs during the post-mortem exam. The cause of death is established as drowning. Definitely the cause of death. Discussion and opinion by the current chief medical examiner says the autopsy findings, result of the chemical tests done on the right and left heart blood, are all supportive of drowning. The only evidence available for review at this time was the histopathological slides taken during the autopsy of the bruises, just basically the micro samples of her actual physical body parts, organs. And 5 items of evidence were collected and placed into the department of the coroner in 1981 when it first happened. A tube of blood, a blood swatch, modified sexual assault kit, hair kit, and pubic hair kit were originally taken as samples for the investigation. There are conflicting statements as to when the decedent, Natalie Wood, went missing from the boat and whether there were verbal arguments between her and her husband, Robert Wagner. It was clear from the restaurant manager's statement that the call about her missing from the Splendor came only at 1:30 a.m. on the 29th of November. The fact that her stomach contained 500 cc's of partially digested food material supports the opinion of the time of death being around midnight, especially given the information that dinner was consumed between 8 and 9 p.m. With the presence of fresh bruises in the upper extremities in the right forearm, left wrist area, and small scratch in the anterior neck, this examiner is unable to exclude, this is the important part, he was unable to exclude non-accidental mechanism causing these injuries, basically against her will. That's pretty much the short. They can't identify if those bruises happened, if there was some sort of struggle before she hit the water. And that's why that was sort of their findings when they reopened the case. Based on the fact that she was wearing a blue and red plaid flannel nightgown, down jacket, socks with no underclothing, but had jewelry, a ring and a bracelet on her right hand, 3 rings on her left hand, and a chain around her waist, and B, the intoxicated state, and C, lack of any life jacket, D, the dinghy having never been used, meaning, as I mentioned, the engine was on off and the oars were still tied down to the dinghy. It appears that Miss Wood drowned within a short time of her entry into the water. The location of the bruises and multiplicity of the bruises, lack of head trauma or facial bruising support bruising having occurred prior to the entry into the water. Since there were many unanswered questions and limited additional evidence available for evaluation, it is thought by this medical examiner that the manner of death should be left as undetermined. The case was discussed with the former chief medical examiner, Dr. Noguchi. The cause of death will be changed to drowning and other undetermined factors. Manner will be changed to undetermined. Now, when they were reopening the case, they were actually looking for body parts which would still be in storage, meaning pieces of her flesh that they would have kept at the LA County Coroner's Office for examination further. And they're saying that 5 items were collected in the evidence department back when it first happened. Based on a final mode of accident, the below 2 items were disposed of, a hair kit and a pubic hair kit. According to the evidence log, the remaining 3 items listed below were booked into our evidence and are still in our custody. An exhaustive search to locate these items was conducted on March 6, 2012, and none were located. It was possible that based on the final mode of accident, these items were also disposed of without documentation or released to the LA Sheriff's Department without documentation. That would be the blood swatch, and the sexual assault kit. During the above-mentioned search, a medical evidence type envelope containing prescription drugs belonging to this case was found. Documentation of this item was entered into the evidence log. The LA Sheriff's Department was notified, and the evidence was released to the LA Sheriff's Department technician. And records of disposal were not maintained in 1981, but all below listed specimens are presumed to have been discarded. That would be blood, bile, urine, liver, kidney, stomach, 2 additional tubes of blood, intestinal contents, and nasal swab. Basically, the samples that they could investigate. And they did find the slides, but there were other things they could not find. I asked Craig about this today. Well, when they opened the case originally, they had maintained pieces of her body. The sections of the skin on the right forearm with the bruise show subcutaneous contusion, which is very fresh. Basically, a bruise. And they actually cut those pieces off of her. Now, I find that really interesting. So I asked Craig about that, Craig Harvey, and this is his quote. Because I always wonder, what do they do? If they have to keep body parts, like, say, a brain or those bruises from her body, what do they do with those? Because they, like if somebody's stabbed, what they'll do is they literally cut that square of stab out so they can figure out by the design of the hole and how deep it is, they can determine what kind of blade it was that caused that wound. And with they kept these squares of her skin, of her flesh, so they could do further testing on them to find out, how they could do that. And I asked him, well, what do they do after that? What happens if the person's already buried? Do they reunite the body parts with the body after they're already buried? And Craig said that typically body parts are returned to the decedent, meaning the dead person's family, or the dead person themselves after the autopsy. Organs are often sectioned and are rarely kept whole. As I just mentioned, they kept those little samples in the on the slides. The sectioned tissues that are of interest for microscopic study are fixed in formalin, stained, and looked at microscopically. So there's chemicals that will focus on what exactly they're looking for that would, it's like if you use luminol to see blood on the carpet or urine or whatever, they put stain on these things to highlight certain things, maybe drugs that they're looking for, or alcohol, or something like that. So the tissue not needed goes back to the body. It takes several weeks to complete the analysis. Preserved tissue is kept for a period of time, then disposed. Tissues prepared for histology blocks are kept for a much longer period, and any microscopic slides are kept forever. Those are the ones that they have on supply still at the LA County Coroner. Keep in mind the circumstances at the time pointed to an accidental cause of death. I always told people, Craig is telling me this now, I always told people they keep only what's necessary and they don't keep souvenirs. And he also explained to me that the bruises they remove from the right forearm, the right knee, and the right ankle. So I asked, well, if the family would get to the remains, but do you know what would typically be done with them when the person is already buried? If they have a brain and the person's already buried, what do they do with the brain? And he told me it's rare, but it's not impossible to reunite organs with bodies after death. We have exhumed buried remains to reunite and have cremated material to be placed with previously cremated remains. Sometimes families can get really possessive over such matters, which is completely understandable, to physical pieces of your loved one. In the majority of the cases, we take what we need to determine the cause and manner of death. We discard what we no longer need in accordance with our retention policy, and in the immediate autopsy materials placed back with the body. That's if it happens right away. Now, my buddy Mike Steen, who was the funeral director who handled Natalie Wood's funeral, and we'll be talking to him in the future, he told me the autopsy had been finished and Natalie Wood's organs were returned. The death certificate says pending at that point, the original death certificates, to see what toxicology would say. He says, I personally seldom put organs back in the body following an autopsy. I would put the organs in a plastic bag and place them at the foot of the casket. And that's what he did. Natalie Wood's, the organs were returned and put in a plastic bag and put at the foot of Natalie Wood in the casket. And I know that she was buried in a full-length fur coat to cover the bruises on her arms. Yeah, and we spoke to Alan Abbott, who worked with the mortuary as well, who was an embalmer who worked with the mortuary on Natalie Wood, or he was there or something. But he explained that the pieces were taken out of her, and they had to put a coat on her to cover up the missing pieces. But the missing pieces, except for the microslides, were returned to Natalie in her casket. So the official cause of death has been changed on her death certificate to drowning and undetermined factors. And I know Dr. Noguchi got into a lot of trouble because at the press conference he said that there was an argument, and that you're starting to get into personal issues at that point, not the physical body, what happened to her. But according to Dr. Noguchi, somebody had asked him while they were on microphone in his ear, but it was overheard, that there was an argument between Christopher Walken and Natalie Wood for whatever reason. Now, lastly, I found Robert Wagner's book. And I had, I wanted to, since he never talked publicly about it, he says that, well, first of all, there's another thing I wanted to point out. Natalie Wood, they always say, well, she was afraid of the water. She did get motion sickness because we know she had motion sickness drugs with her but they had a yacht. They knew her at the restaurant. So she spent time on the water. It wasn't like she was, she didn't care to go in the water. She couldn't swim or was apparently afraid of the water in that regard. But she'd been on the water a lot. It's not like, she was against her will. They had been on that ship many times. They owned a ship, and they named it after one of Natalie's movies. So he says, on Friday morning, November 27th, we picked up Christopher Walken in Marina del Rey, where our boat was docked, and made the 22-mile voyage to Catalina Island. And a couple of hours later, we took the Valiant, that's the little boat, to the island where we did some shopping. Then we went to a place called the Galleon and had margaritas and beer chasers. Around 9 o'clock, we headed back to the boat, but Natalie was worried about the water, which had developed a swell. I guess that would mean like high tide or something like that. That makes sense to me. But it was certainly, the water was a bit choppy as I understand it. Natalie was comfortable on the boat itself, but didn't like being in the water and the possibility of being in the water because she was a bad swimmer. She finally agreed to go back to Catalina on the dinghy, and we had more drinks over dinner. Now, it says Natalie Wood got angry and told Dennis Davern, who took care of the Splendor, that's the captain, the skipper of the ship rather, to take her to Avalon in the dinghy. She spent the night at the Pavilion Lodge. This is the night before it happened. It's kind of, just shows that she had a history of just saying, you know what, I'm out of here. And she would take off. So that's probably why they were weren't alarmed when they first found that she was missing. The next morning, Natalie came back to the boat and everything was fine. She cooked breakfast for Walken and me on the Splendor, and I suggested moving the boat to calmer waters. By 1 o'clock, we were anchored offshore in Isthmus Cove on the northern end of the island, which is more isolated than the southern end. A little while after that, everyone took a nap. When I woke up, I found a note from Natalie saying that she and Christopher had taken the dinghy and gone to the island. They went to Doug's Harbor Reef for about 2 hours. I wasn't angry, but I was agitated. I called the shore boat and joined them. There was a service. If you're on a boat, you need to ride back. It was like a water taxi. He says nobody was near drunk at that point. They got back to the salon, had more drinks. It was at that point that I got pissed off. Christopher Walken began talking about the pursuit of a career which he admitted was more important to him than his personal life. He clearly thought Natalie should live like that too, which rather neatly overlooked the fact that she was the mother of 3 small children. He says, I finally had enough. Why the fuck don't you stay out of her career, I said. She's got enough people telling her what to do. Walken and I got into an argument. At one point, I picked up a wine bottle slammed it on the table, and broke it into pieces. Natalie was already below decks at that point. She had gotten up during the argument. She didn't rush out. She just got up and went down the 3 steps to the salon of the boat, to the master cabin to go to the bathroom. The last time I saw my wife, she was fixing her hair in a little vanity in the bathroom while I was arguing with the walk-in. I saw her shut the door. She was going to bed. If I were to categorize the emotional temperature, I would say that things are threatening to get physical, but the fact is they never did. After some minutes on the deck, fresh air helped us calm down, and we got back to the salon where we sat for a while, but not long. At this point, everything was fine between Christopher Walken and I, and Christopher went to bed. I sat up for a while with Dennis Davern, the skipper of the boat, and then I had gone to bed. I went below and Natalie wasn't there. Strange. I went back up on the deck and looked for her and noticed the dinghy was gone. Stranger, I remember wondering if she'd taken the dinghy because of the argument, and then I thought, no way, because she was terrified of dark water, and besides that, the dinghy fired up very loudly. So remember, the engine wasn't done. I think Natalie took off in the dinghy, is what Dennis Davern said. At that point, I thought she'd gone back to Doug's Harbor Reef. I radioed the shore boat and went back to the restaurant. Christopher and Dennis stayed on the boat. When I got back to the island, the restaurant was closed. Natalie wasn't anywhere around the dock area, nor was the dinghy. By this time, it was 1:30 a.m. in the morning of November 29th. I was scared and confused. Dennis radioed for help on the Harbor Channel, which is monitored by a Bay Watch, a sort of private coast patrol. Then I called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard came up to the boat, and they went through the Splendor from top to bottom, from the bilge on up, and they checked everything. They started a search rescue, which is very difficult at night, crisscrossing the ocean surface with searchlights. We sat through the night in the salon waiting to hear what happened. In the morning, about 5:30, they found the Valiant, the little dinghy, in an isolated cove. The key was in the opposition. The gear was neutral. The oars were fastened. Natalie wasn't on it. 2 hours later, they found my wife. Natalie was wearing the parka, the windbreaker. That helped spot her. The harbor master was the one who got her out of the water in that net I was telling you about, that sort of basket thing. And I remember the morning was sunny, and I remember that I was standing on the aft deck when Doug pulled up and got out of his boat. "Where is she?" I asked him. Doug looked at me. "She's dead, RJ." My knees went out. So Walken and Wagner clearly, according to Robert Wagner, got into an argument. Natalie Wood, it seems, got fed up, but because of these doubts that Dennis Davern had raised 40 or 30 years later when he had a book to sell, the case was reopened. And basically they couldn't describe, or they couldn't determine, when those bruises happened on her legs, on the back of her legs, and on her arms. Although they all match up with the fact that she was trying to get into the dinghy several times and was scraped. She scraped up her arms and her legs trying to get into this. So they can be explained that way, but they can't positively say that for sure because there were no witnesses and they didn't have the tissues to examine once more. So it was a very long and complicated autopsy report, and there's more. There's so much more that I didn't get into. But there's a diagram here of Natalie Wood when they found her and where these bruises are located. And they're located on her back mostly, but you can see on the forearm, and all of these things sort of explain away what happened to her. I thank Craig Harvey for helping me with this, Chief Harvey, who has been a great friend, and like Dr. Noguchi, who did, Dr. Noguchi did Marilyn Monroe and Janis Joplin and Bobby Kennedy. Very kind people. Craig is a very kind man, and if you ask him a proper question, he will always answer, honestly. Dr. Noguchi, Craig told me, is the same way. If you want to go, what was it like to be, at the autopsy of Marilyn Monroe, you're not going to get a reaction. But if you come up with an intelligent question to ask a scientist, which is what they basically are, they are scientists, and you ask them an intelligent question, they will stop and they will take the time to answer those questions. And Craig still, even though he's retired, will still do that for me, as you may have heard in the when I did the El Coyote video about the Tate victims, Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, about the contents of their stomach, and when they were found, Craig, did an interview with me about that. And I also thank Mike Steen, the funeral director, who will allow me to interview him at some point soon. And he's got great stories. He handled, John Belushi. He handled the Peter Lawford's body being exhumed, his cremains and being scattered. Amazing stories. Both of these men do, and I'm proud to call them both friends. So, and I'm proud that you watched this video because it's a long video, but I think it's fascinating. So this is in our archive, and whenever we open our museum, you'll see it up close. Natalie Wood's Darvon prescription. I got to thank E.J. Fleming for this too. As a reminder, I have a Patreon page that's listed below. If you subscribe for a couple of bucks a month at least, more is welcome. There's lots of other information available on the Patreon page, videos, and I also respond to messages on the Patreon page too. And we do a monthly video that's personal just for the Patreon sponsors. It's just a couple of bucks a month that you can subscribe. So I certainly appreciate that, and I appreciate you all for watching. It was exhausting, but I hope you got something out of it. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention. And until next time.